x in the local variable t, and then it will add 1 to x, and it will return the value of t, which is a snapshot of the value of x before the increment. And define sub. And here I have the main subroutine. Let's say the main subroutine has a local variable I, and it doesn't like that because it changes the case. So I'm going to have to, let's change it to variable k. And then what we'll do is we'll say k gets initialized to a value of 5. We print the result of invoking post increment. Use local variable k to specify parameter x. And then we'll print the value of k itself and define the main subroutine. And invoke main outside of all the subroutine definitions. This sample program does not involve any topic that we have not talked about up to this point. Can someone predict what it is going to print?
5 and then 6.
It prints a 5 and then a 6. Very good. Okay. So we'll go ahead and see why it is going to do that, because to some people it may be obvious, but it is not too obvious if this is the first time you encounter concepts like this. We need one comments column because we have printing, but that's later on. We'll just go ahead and scroll this off the screen for the time being. Then we have line number. The precondition, there's nothing to say because we don't have any global variables. And then we start with the execution of line 14. Line 14 is invoking main. So that means we have to set up the return line number column to post. When we are done with main, we are done with the entire program. We also have to allocate a column for local variable k. Since it is a local variable, it starts with an unknown value represented by a question mark. Are we doing okay so far? Pretty boring stuff up to this point. Then we move on to line 10 inside the subroutine main. It initializes k to 5. Fine, that's pretty easy. Then we move on to line 11. Line 11 is a print statement. But before I can print anything, I have to first invoke the subroutine post inc because I want to find out what it is going to return, and the return value is what I am printing in this case. Now, because post increment is going to return a value, that means I cannot use return line number. I have to use return info because I'm going to return back to line 11. There's more stuff to do on that line after I return. And as a result, to represent that, I have to specify I'm returning back to line 11, but by the time I return to it, I still have something to print, and that something to print will be the return value of post inc, or post increment. Post increment also has a parameter x, and it has a local variable t. What do I use to specify parameter x? The argument is k. K is a local variable. It lives on column D, so that's what I'll use here. X is an alias of column D. And T, being a local variable, will start with an unknown value. Do we have any questions at this point? Okay, fairly standard stuff. Okay. Then we move on to post increment. The first action line of post increment is line 4. Line 4 doesn't do anything particularly tricky. It is going to copy the value of x to t. X is a reference to column D. Column D has a value of 5 at this point, and as a result, my local variable t would end up with a value of 5. Line 5 is going to increment x by 1. X is an alias of column D. Column D is here. It has a value of 5. 5 plus 1 is 6. We store the 6 back into parameter x, which is a reference to column D. As a result, column D is updated to 6. Are we doing okay so far? Nothing really tricky at this point. Now we move on to line 6. Line 6 is a return statement. It returns the value of t, not x. So that means we are effectively returning 5 in this case. when you return the value, you copy and paste the return info cell, and then you change the question mark to the value that you're returning. In this case, again, what are we returning? We are returning t, which has a value of 5. Very good. Okay? And now we move on to line 7. Line 7 is the end of the subroutine. We just have to deallocate the 3 columns. And then move back onto continue where? Line 11, right? Because the return info is telling me that I should continue execution on line 11. And line 11 should look like this at this time. In other words, all I have to do is to print the value of 5 to the screen. Then I'm done with line 11. I move on to line 12. Line 12 is just printing the value of k. The value of k is 6 at this point. So when I execute line 12, it will print the value of 6. Then I'm over at line 13. Line 13 is the end of the main subroutine. Deallocate the columns for this invocation, and then we go back to post, and we're all done. Is that okay so far? Now, does it look kind of convoluted? That is, it's increments, but it returns the value before the increment. Okay. You will see this type of construct in a C and C++ class, and the way it is expressed in a C++ class on line 11 is just print, in this case, k++. Okay. The operator that represents post increment is a plus operator after the variable that you're going to post increment. Okay. It doesn't make a lot of sense in this class at this point, but when you move on to a C++ class, you will see this construct used fairly often, especially when combined with accessing elements in an array. Okay, this is a leftover of some of the features that are more targeting experienced programmers. But you will see this type of code in a C program, and as a result, you should understand what it means. And in this class, I can explain it using just the concepts that we have talked about so far. Are there any questions so far about this? No questions? This is actually the first time that we have a parameter that is passed by reference and also at the same time returning a value from the same subroutine, which is basically saying that there's no conflict. Okay, you can combine these things any way you want. You can have a subroutine that has a pass by reference parameter returning the result of a calculation, and at the same time use a return value to return another value. Okay, so those two concepts do not conflict. You can have both of those at the same time. Are we okay with this? Okay, so let me go ahead and save this file. Call that post increment. And now we are ready to move on. So I'll go ahead and change the highlight to records and types. Well, let's see where we should begin here. Let's talk about types first. Okay, why do we have types? To understand why we have types, let's think about these examples. Let's think about this. What is the result of this? You guys should know that. 68? Okay. What is the result of this? True, because true, and if at least one side is true, the disjunction is true. Let's try one more thing. Okay, let's try this. That's false. Okay, so we have no problem evaluating all of these operators. Okay, the operators refer to the plus operator, the disjunction operator, and the comparison, the greater than operator. Okay? Now let's go ahead and see some really awkward examples. What do you think is the result of this? We don't know. Why not? Why do we have a problem with this? Why do we have a problem when we say true multiply false?
It's a logical value.
Because true and false are logical values, and they're Boolean values. But what do you think the multiplication operator expects? Values. I mean, numerical values. Doesn't have to be integers. Can be decimal values, fractions, even irrational numbers. But it wants numbers. Okay. The multiplication operator has an expectation of what is on its left-hand side and what is on its right-hand side. They both have to be numbers. So when you try to give an operator, the multiplication operator, a Boolean value on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side, or both of the left and the right-hand side, it doesn't know what to do with it. Okay? So technically speaking, a programming language can basically say, look at this and say, I don't know what to do with it, and it is an error. Okay? Now, it is not considered an error in C because C does not really have a sense of what is a Boolean. Okay, so that's going to throw a wrench into what we talk about in this class, but just bear with me at this point, and we'll just say that this does not make any sense. What about this? Is a conjunction operator. As a conjunction operator, what does it expect on both sides? Boolean values, right? True, false values on both sides. And what is 2? 2 is not true, it is not false, it is not the same type of value. So in this case, the answer is, again, it should be an error because it is not compatible. The type of the operand or the values to process is not compatible to the expectations of the operator itself. Okay? In other words, the concept of a type is here because certain operators can only work on certain kinds of values, and what we call a kind of value is technically called a type in programming. Is that okay so far? Is that making any sense? Okay. If you want an analogy, since we have been using like containers, as variables, you can just think about a wine glass. Okay, it's supposed to only contain wine because you can talk about certain things about wine that does not apply to other types of fluids. Okay, like is this wine dry? How dry is the wine? Is it fruity? Is it dry? And so on and so forth. So what if someone pours milk into the wine glass, and you ask the question, is this milk dry or is this milk fruity? You cannot say anything about that because milk does not have those attributes. And it's the same reason here. Okay? So are we doing okay with the concept of types? Okay, they're basically restrictions of certain things cannot happen if the types do not match. And in this class, we have talked about at least the first two. We have talked about integers. We have talked about the next one, which is Boolean values, true, false values. And in general purpose programming, you also have a string type. A string type is what you need when you need to process text information, like addresses, names, and so on and so forth. Those would be represented as strings. But in this class, we don't really use strings too much, or we have not used strings at all. And these are all the built-in types. The way we denote a type is basically just to add a colon, and then we specify what kind of a type we are expecting for that variable or parameter. In this case, if you have a subroutine called find